We're picking up from Rosh Hashanah 33a, so that on the fifth line in the Sefaria, so that we can conclude Rosh Hashanah to make our siyum this Friday. Ein ma'akvin et hatinokot miltkoa. Ha-nashim ma'akvin v'hatanya. Ein ma'akvin lo et hanashim v'lo et hatinokot miltkoa b'yom tov. Amar Abaye lo kasha. Ha Rabbi Yehuda. Ha Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Shimon. The rabbis are arguing about whether children and women are permitted to sound the shofar and what the meaning would be in the event that they do so. Titania, Dabera b'nei Yisrael somchin, ve'ein banot Yisrael somchot, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi or Rabbi Shimon omrim, nashim somchot rishut. So the argument about whether women may place their hands on offerings and whether they're obligated to do so or not, and how that might relate to shofar. Aval, mit asek bahem ad sheyilmedu. Amar Rabbi Elazar afilu b'Shabbat. Tanya nami hache. Mit askin bahen ad sheyilmedu. Afilu b'Shabbat. Ve'ein ma'akvin hatinokot miltukoa b'Shabbat. Ve'ein tzarich lomar b'yom tov. So the question is, the process of teaching children about how to learn to blow shofar. And the idea basically being you teach them how to blow shofar before they become of the majority age so that they can actually know how to blow shofar. Hagufa kasha amrat mit asek behen ad sheyilmedu v'afilu b'Shabbat alma lichatchila amrinan tik'u v'hadartana ein ma'akvin Ikuva hu dela ma'akvin ha lechatchila lo amrinan litkoa. So just because you're teaching them to blow doesn't mean it lahatchila at the beginning will keep them from actually being able to blow altogether. And that's a kasha of whether a person who hasn't been properly trained to blow is blowing or not. Lo kasha. Kan bekatan higia lechinuch, kan bekatan shelo higia lechinuch. It's no problem. One of these clauses refers to a child who has been educated in how to blow the shofar or has been educated in the mitzvot, and the other is in a child who has not been educated in such. Umitaskin lo yatsa. Ha tokea lashir yatsa. Lamai messiah le laraba. De amar rava, ha tokea lashir yatsa. Dilma tokea lashir. Nami mitasek kare la. Right. So the question is, back to a thing that we learned many pages ago, whether one is doing it lashir, i.e. they are blowing because they're making a fun sound for music, or whether they're trying to fulfill the mitzvah of shofar. V'hashomea min hamitasek lo yatsa, aval hashomea min hashamia la'atzmo mai yatsa. Lema tehaveh Tiuvta te de Rav Zera, de Amar le Rav Zera le Shamaya, ikuin litkia li. So when you, if a person is blowing shofar for music's sake, for instance, and is not really having presence of mind to actually blow shofar, has not fulfilled the obligation. So back into our argument about keva and kavanah, whether you have to have intent to blow something, intent to blow something, or whether you're just doing it when you just do it. Dilma adai ditna resha mit asek tana seifa nami mit asek. Perhaps one clause of the Gemara regards to a person without intent, and the second with someone who has intent. And that's where we conclude. Moving on to our next Mishnah. Ma'nitin, Seder Tikiyot, Shalosh Shel Shalosh Shalosh. Shiur Tikiya Keshalosh Truot, Shiur Trua Keshalosh Yevavot. Taka Barishona, Umishoch Bashniya, Kishtaim, Ein Biyado Ela Achat. So the rabbis are going to discuss what are the tikiyas, and they mention two that we know, and they don't mention one that we know, which is very Talmudic, right? They mention the tikiyah and they mention the teruah, but they don't mention shavarim. That's because they're going to use different language for shavarim in our text. Our Mishnah continues. Misha beirach ve'achar kach nitmana lo shofar tokea umeria utokea shalosh pe'amim. Right? And then you do the blessings and you do tekiah, Maria, tekiah, or tekiah, teruah tekiah might be the way you might do it. And you do them each 3 da-da, 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 right? Kishem sheshaliach tzibor chayav, kach haya yechid ve'yechid chayav. Rabban Gamliel Omer, shaliach tzibor motzi et ha-rabim yadei chovatam. Just as the prayer leader is obligated in saying the tefillah, so too everyone else is. Rabban Gamliel disagrees and says that you can have the shaliach tzibor discharge the obligation for everyone. Meaning, if I say the tefillah, the amidah, for the holiday, as the rabbi of the community, everybody else is fulfilled in their obligation. They don't have to do an individual. All right, onward to the Gemara. V'hatanya, shiur tekiah kitrua, right? There's an objection. The way we do tekiah should be the same as the way we do teruah. Amar Abaye, Tanya didanka, chashev tekiah dekulhu babe, truot dekulhu babe. Tana bara, ka chashiv chad bava v'tu la. So the rabbis are getting into, and Abaye says there is no difficulty. The Tana of our Mishnah counts the tekiah of all sets and the teruot of all sets, right? Add it all up, and you fulfilled your obligation. Shior teruah kish shalosh yevavot. V'hatanya shior teruah kish shlosh shavarim. Here we get our phrase of shavarim, which does not appear in the Mishnah. And the question is, do we keep the length of them the same, tekiah, teruah, and shavarim, or is the length different? Amar Abaye, b'ha v'dai peligi dichtiv yom teruah yihi lachem umitargaminin yom yabava yehe lachon uketiv be'ime de sisra be'ad hacholon nishkafa v'taibev beb et em sisra mar savar genuche ganach umar savar yelule yalel. So the rabbis are playing with this phrase yavava and what exactly it is. One sage holds that it means it's a whimper, and another one says it's more like a moan, right? So we're talking about, I think, the teruah and what the teruah should sound like, if I'm not mistaken. All right, Tanu Rabbanan, min ein sheba shofar, Talmud Lamar, v'ha'avirta shofar teruah. The rabbis taught, from where do we derive that it should be done on Rosh Hashanah with a shofar? And we get a verse. This feels like something we should have already known, but I think we're just bringing back a baraita just in case we've never used it before. Ein li ele beyovel, Rosh Hashanah minayin. We've seen this before. This appeared a couple chapters. Talmud Lamar b'chodesh hashvi'i. She'ein Talmud Lamar b'chodesh hashvi'i. Uma Talmud Lamar b'chodesh hashvi'i sheyu kol hatruot shel chodesh shvi'i zeh kazeh. So we are deriving the fact that this is the shofar for, and the blasts are specifically the blasts that we use for Rosh Hashanah, and they're different from the ones that we use at Yovel. Uminayin shepshuta lifneha, Talmud Lamar, v'havirta shofar tru'ah, uminayin shepshuta la'achreha, Talmud Lamar, tavirin shofar. Where do we derive the difference between the straight blast, i.e. the tekiah, versus the shofar teruah, and we get a pair of verses that help us out with that. Ve'ein li ela b'yovel, b'Rosh Hashanah minayin. So this tells us a thing that we've already learned. We have basis in the verses above for why we blow at Yovel, but not for Rosh Hashanah. We get a different verse for Rosh Hashanah. Talmud Lamar, b'chodesh hashvi'i. That's what the chodesh hashvi'i line is doing in there, which chodesh hashvi'i is the beginning of Rosh Hashanah and not for the Yovel year. She'ein Talmud lamar b'chodesh hashvi'i, u'ma Talmud lamar b'chodesh hashvi'i, shehayu kol hatruot hachodesh hashvi'i zeh bazeh. There is no need to say seventh month here. We already learned that somewhere else in the verse. Therefore, it must refer to the use of shofar for that seventh month. Umin ayin l'shalosh shel shalosh shalosh. Talmud lamar va'avirta shofar truah. Shabbaton zichron truah. Yom truah yeh lachem. So why are we doing verses of 3? We pin it to the fact that there are 3 words in each of these verses that implies the blowing of shofar. One for Trua, one for Tekiah, one for Shavarim. Uminayin liten et ha'omer shel zeh bazeh v'shel zeh bazeh Talmud lamar shvi'i legazera shava. So why are we doing a connection from one verse to another? It's an exegetical principle called a gezerah shava, where when you see a word in one verse and a word in another verse that don't seem to be necessarily linked to each other, they are a direct link callback one to another. And the word that they're linking is shavi'i. Ha-ketzad shalosh shehen tesha shiur tkiya ki trua shiur trua ki shlosh shvarim. These 3 are actually 9, and that gives us this total connection of 3 Trua, Shavarim, and Tekiyas together. Ha Tanya, Ni'ikar metai la behekedsha, v'hashta metai le b'gzera shava. V'hachika mar ilav gzera shava havi mitina la behekshea hash de ate begzera shava hekshech lo tzarich. The rabbis are now playing with which exegetical principle is the correct exegetical principle to make this move. I will not explain that further. V'hai tanamai mete la gezera shav midbar de tanan de utkatem terua tekiya bifnei atzma utrua bifnei atzma. Ata omer tekiya bifnei atzma v'trua bifnei atzma. O eno ela tekiya utukrua achad hi. Shehi omer ube hakil et hakahal titkoa v'lo tariu. Havi omer tekiya bifnei atzma v'trua bifnei atzma. Do we make a gezerah shava in order to get both the basis for tekiya and trua, or do they each have their own verse? It is explained as such. Uminayin shepshuta lifneha Talmud lamar utekiya tem trua. Uminayin shepshuta la'achareha Talmud lamar trua tekiya. And why the tekiya blast and why the trua blast as it is? Both are further derived by verses from the Torah. Rabbi Yishmael banu shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruka amar eno tzarich hare hu omer utkatem trua shnit ve'en Talmud lamar shenit ma Talmud lamar shenit ze bana av shekol makom shenemar trua tehe tekiya shniya la ve'en li ela bamidbar. Barosh Hashanah minayin, Talmud lamar, terua legezera shav. And there is a debate by Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan, as to whether this basis is accurate, or whether there is other scriptural basis based on a different gezerah shava as to why these 2 verses need to, why Trua and Tekiah have their own basis in Gemara. Based on verses from Torah. You don't, by the way, if you have a scriptural verse, you don't need a gezerah shava. And so that's another of the problems that's being elucidated up above. Are we getting it for a verse? Are we getting it from a gezerah shava? Or do each of these have their own verses and they don't need a gezerah shava? V'shalosh teruot ne'emar b'Rosh Hashanah, Shabbaton zichron truah, yom truah, v'havarta shofar truah. Again, we're now having the argument about whether these verses are bases for the number of blasts on their own, and or not. Ushte tekiyot lekol echad ve'echad, and there are 2 tekiyot for each and every trua. Matzinu meidin shalosh truot v'shesh tekiyot ne'amar b'Rosh Hashanah, shtayim midbar trua Torah, ve'echad midivrei sofrim. Shabtom zichron trua v'avarta shofar trua midivrei Torah, yom trua yeh lachem le talmudo hu ba. So the basis for some of these may be from Torah, and others may be from the oral law or by verbal analogy. Splitting the difference again. Rabbi Yishmael bar Nechemani Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Yonatan. Achad midivrei Torah, ushte midivrei Sofrim. They disagree about whether one is from Torah and two is from the Talmud, or two is from Torah and one is from Talmud. V'avarta shofar trua midivrei Torah, shabton zichron trua v'yom trua yelachem l'talmudo huba. My talmudo huba. Me boy. Bayom velo balayla. We get the basis for that last verse telling us that we do it in the day and not in the night. Ve'idach, bayom velo balayla minayin lan. How do we know it's by the day? Nafkala mi bayom haKippurim, because it says bayom haKippurim and not erev Kippurim. Ubayom haKippurim yalif, nigmar nami minai lipshuta lifneha upshuta laachrena. Ve'avarta ta'aviru lo mashma lahu. We continue. The Tana derives this halacha from the phrase on the Day of Atonement. Let's take it from a different place, which is this whole idea of the straight blast. And then they're going to do a move based on the word vehavarta and another move off of the word ta'aviru, which implies tekiyas for each of those references to a possible shofar blast in a verse. Elamai darshebahu vehavarta Kidarav matna, de amar rav matana, v'havarta derech avarto, v'taviru de kamar rachmana ne'avarta bayat. What do we learn? What does the other rabbi learn from this? He says that v'havarta and taviru don't necessarily imply that you blow it twice, but rather one implies a carrying and the other is about the blowing. Ve'idach de rav matna, de mitdat shani midibur dibure. And the other rabbi gets it from a different place and assumes that this is just a matter of normal language, and te'avarta is not a halachic statement. Ta'aviru biyad lo matzeit amrat degamar avara mi Moshe. Ketiv hacha, ve'avarta shofar trua, uktiv hatam, v'itzav Moshe v'yaviru kol b'machaneh, ma lahalan b'kol, afkan b'kol. We continue with an argument that is an attempted rejection of the principle of carrying the shofar by hand, not being a deoraita gezerah, but rather that Moshe is referring to something else when we bring the idea of he'avarta, v'taviru. V'lav tana de maitai la memidbar. I ma lahalan chatzutzrot afkan chatzutzrot. We're back to a wonderful old thing. Why, if there is which comes from like the third parak, why, if it tells us in the Torah that we're supposed to blow trumpets, do we not blow trumpets? Talmud Lamar, Tikiya b'chodesh shofar b'kesel leyom chagenu. Ezehu chag shechodesh mitkaseh bo, havi omer ze Rosh Hashanah, ka'amar rachmana shofar. So therefore the verse tells us that we sound the shofar at the new moon, but it leaves out the chatzutzrot, the trumpets. Atkin Rabbi Avahu Bekesar, Tekiya Shalosha Shavarim, Trua Tekiya, Ma Naffach, Ielule Yalel, La Bed Tekiya Trua Utekiya, Ve'i Ganuche Ganach, La Abed Tekiya Shalosha Shavarim Utekiya. Rabbi Abahu had his own way of blowing things in Caesarea, which is not necessarily exactly the way we do it today, and he begins to explain his rationale of Tekiya, Shvarim, and Trua. Misapka le I ganuche ganach I gelule yalel matkef la Rabbi Avera. So the rabbis are going to argue about whether they're blowing the shofar correctly or not. V'dilma yalul have, v'ka mafsek, shlosha shvarim, bein tru'a l'tkiya. Tehadar aved tkiya trua tkiya. Umat kifle ravina, udilma ganuche have, v'ka mafseka, terua bein shvarim letekiah. Dehahadar aved tekiah shvarim tekiah. They are disagreeing about whether the ganuch sound, which they think is the key sound of shvarim, should be in the middle of tekiah shvarim terua, or whether it should not be there, and then what your overall blasts should ultimately sound like. Difficult, interesting, and it would be fun to map this out, but also very confusing if we're trying to speed read. Ela, Rabbi Avahu, my atkein, I ganuchu ganach ha aveda, I yelulu yela ha aveda, maspeka le dilma ganach vayelech. So the rabbis basically explain that they do a lot of these blasts to cover their tuchases in the event that they are supposed to be doing a ganach, but they're actually doing a yalel, right? A ganach is translated here as a moaning, a yalel is translated as a whimpering. Ve'i hachalev nami ifka, tekiah terua shalosh shavarim utekiah dilma yalel v'ganach, stama de milta, ki mitra be'inish milta, beresh ganach v'hadar yelech. The normal way of things is that when a person does something bad, first they moan and then they whimper. So do them both, Bobala. Takaba rishona umeshach b'shniya kishtayim amar Rabbi Yochanan shema. The Mishnah taught if one sounded first tekiah and then extended the second tekiah into the two tekiyot, Rabbi Yochanan said, if one is shama, Tesha tekiyot b'tesha sha'ot bayom yatsa. If you hear 9 blasts at 9 points in the day, you're yotzi. You fulfilled your obligation. Tanya nami chachi. We are also taught in a baraita. Shma tesha tekiyot b'tesha sha'ot bayom yatsa. Same thing appears in the baraita. Mitsha'a banei adam ke'echad lo yatsa. If one heard a tekiah from this one afterward and a terua from another one, they may not have, sorry, not what it says. If you heard a blast from 9 different people simultaneously, you've not fulfilled your, I was like, I don't understand what they're saying. If you have 9 people stand up there and do all of it, you can't say you did the same as hearing it 9 different times. Kind of logical, but
that's the same as before when you have 2 things at once.
Yeah.
You don't know which you're hearing, so it doesn't count.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the Talmud gets repetitious in case it's not clear, but they have a different rationale here, which is parallel hearing doesn't, they're overhearing one another. Here, it's basically like, don't think that you can hear them all together and fulfill your obligation, right? Tkiga mize trua mize yatsa afilu bisegrugin v'afilu kol hayom kulo. So even if you overheard them at different intervals. Umi amar Rabbi Yochanan hachi, who says, did Rabbi Yochanan actually say this? Kamar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadak. B'halel uba megillah im shaha kedei ligmor et kula choser l'rosh. Lo kasha hadidei chad derabye. So, yeah, basically, it doesn't have exactly the same feeling regarding Hallel and Megillah. If one pauses and doesn't finish, you may have to go back to the beginning. That logic apparently is being attempted to be applied to the blowing of shofar at 9 different times throughout the day. V'didela v'ha Rabbi Avahu havi mashkil v'azil b'tare de Rabbi Yochanan v'havi kare kriyat shema ki mata lemovot mitonafot ishtik batar de chalif amarle mahu ligmor amarlo im shahita kadei ligmor et kula chazar l'rosh. So the question is then applied to a moment when the rabbi was hearing Shema and he came across some poop, and you can't pray in front of poop or garbage, and so he stopped, and the question is whether he fulfilled his obligation by continuing Shema, or whether it would be better that the rabbi went back to the beginning. Right. V'hachikam arle ledide La savira li lidide, de savira lach. Im shahe kedei ligmor et kula chazar mirosh. If you pause for an interval sufficient to complete the entire Shema, you must return to the beginning. So it really depends on how long you stop. Tanu Rabbanan, Tikiyot, ein me'akvot zo bazo, brachot, ein me'akvot zo bazo. Tikiyot ubrachot shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom Kippurim me'akvot. So we have a baraita that teaches that tikiyot can't invalidate one another. Blessings don't invalidate one another, but shofar blasts and additional blessings do invalidate one another. So again, dealing with the question of being interrupted. By the way, this is all very parallel to something that happens in one of the prakim of brachot about whether in brachot, if you are interrupted, you can pause and keep going, or whether you can go back to the beginning. These are problems that parents have all the time, right? My taima, Amar Rabba, Amar Kodesh Baruch Hu, Imru lifanai barosh Hashanah malchiot zichronot v'shofarot. Malchiot kadei shetamlicheni alechem zichronot kadei sheyavo lefanai zichronechem letova umibai b'shofar. So we get into the question of the use of the blasts during the zichronot shofarot and malchuyot blasts, and in, of course, shofarot, we point out that you are blowing shofar, and it fulfills your spiritual obligation. Misha barach va'achar kach nitmana lo shofar. Tokea umaria v'tokea. Taima de la havi la shofar meikra, ha havi le shofar meikra. Ki shama lahu, aseder brachot shama lahu. Our Mishnah teaches one who recited the blessings of additional prayers, and only afterwards a shofar became available to sound it. He sounds a tekiah, a teruah, and tekiah. So this is a different setup than one who is blowing shofar during the sounding altogether. Rav Papa Bar Shmuel kam le tsalue amar le shamae ki naharna lach tekiah takali. Amar le Rava lo amru ele bechadar ir. Rava said this only applies that you should at each of the ends of the batches of the blessings you sound the shofar. Rava said this only happens when you have 10, not for an individual. Tanya nami hachi keshehu shomein shom'an al haseder ve'al seder berachot. B'may devarim omrim bechever ir aval shalo bechever ir shom'in al haseder ve'shalo al seder berachot v'yachid shalo taka chavero tokea lo v'yachid shalo beirach ein chavero mevarech alav. Again, dealing with the question of whether we're doing shofar blasts in between tekiah, in between malchuyot, zichron, and shofarot, and whether you would do it if you don't have 10, or whether you are, which is referred to here as chever ir, for whatever reason. But for an individual, you would not do so. Umitzvah betokin yoter min habrachot. It's a mitzvah to say more shofar blasts than there are blessings. Ketzad, shtei ayarot be'echad tokin u'bechad mevarchin holchin lemakom shetokin ve'ein holchim lemakom shebarachim. If there are two towns and only one person who knows how to blow the shofar, you go to the place where they blow the shofar and not to the place where they know how to blow the blessings. This is a problem for rabbis who live in towns where they're the only show in town. Pshita, ha baraita, ha derabanan. Of course, the shofar blasts are doraita and the blessings are derabanan. Lo tzricha de'afal gav delahu vadai veha safek. If you've got it, therefore, why is this written here above if we should have already derived it by basic understanding? Kashem sheshaliach tzibor chayav kach kol yechid v'yechid v'chulei. Tanya amru lo l'Rabban Gamliel lidvarehem lama tzibor mitpalalin. Amar lahu kedei lahasbir shaliach tzibor tefilato. Rabbi Gamliel says, according to your statement, why does the congregation recite silent Amidah at all? His response is in order that the prayer leader should have time to get his stuff together for his own prayers, which I, as a prayer leader for the last 20 years, I can very much relate to. Amar lehen Rabban Gamliel, Ledivreichen lama shliach tzibor yored lifnei hateva, amru lo, kidei lahotzi et she'eno baki. Amar lahem, kishem shemotzim et she'eno baki, kach motzim et tabaki. So the question is, what's the point of a shliach tzibor? Which feels like a very basic kind of question that should have come up a couple of tractates ago. But instead, we're dealing with it now, right? The disagreement is whether you are fulfilling your obligation for those who are not baki, or not expert in prayer. But they also even are fulfilling the obligation of one who is a baki. Okay, so that's an understanding of what happens if the shliach tzibor who's preparing for the repetition is not focused enough on the shofar blast, or is focused on the shofar blast potentially, or potentially is focused more during the repetition on the repetition and is not focused on the silent themselves. The congregation may be fulfilling the obligation of the shliach tzibor. That's the way I understand that. Amar Rava Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Modim chachamim Rabban Gamliel. The rabbis agree with Rabban Gamliel here. V'Rav Omar adayin hi machloket. We're still actually disagreeing. Shama Rabbi Chia barei de Rabba bar Nehemia Azil Amra lishmata kameh de Rav Dimi bar Chinana. Rabbis are all disagreeing about who we're agreeing with. Amar le hachi Amar Rav adayin hi machloket. Amar le Rava bar Chana nami hachi ka Amar. Ki Amar Rabbi Yochanan lahu shamata ifleg aleha reish lakish va'amar adain hi machlakta. So we are still debating about whether this has been sufficient, this whole debate about Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis, of whether the shliach tzibor has fulfilled the obligation for the community, or whether the community needs to really say it and cannot have the shliach tzibor discharge their obligation for them. Umi amar Rabbi Yochanan, hachi v'hamar Rabbi Chana tziporaha, amar Rabbi Yochanan, hilchata karaban Gamliel, hilchata michlal defalig. And Rabbi Yochanan actually say this, didn't we learn it from somebody else? Ki salik Rabbi Abba me miyame paresha modim hachamim l'Rabban Gamliel bebaracha shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom HaKippurim v'halacha michlal v'kalig bepalig bebaracha dechol Hashana. Ini v'amar Rabbi Chana tzipora'a amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha k'Rabban Gamliel bebaracha shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom HaKippurim. Ela amar Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak man modim Rabbi Meir v'hilchata michlal b'palig Rabbanan. We're arguing about who we're arguing about and what we're arguing about. Titnan brachot shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom HaKippurim shilech tzibor motzim harabim yedei chavatan divrei Rabbi Meir v'chachamim ramim kashem sheshilech tzibor chayav kach kol yechid v'yechid chayav. Now we're wrapping Yom Kippur into this whole debate, and we're going back a level as to who is debating this principle of whether you fulfill someone else's obligation. My shanahani ilema mishum dinafish kare v'hamar Rav Chanan el amar Rav kevan she'amar ubetoratecha kativ lemor shuv eno tzarich ela mishum de avshi barachot. Rather, it's because there are many blessings and not everybody can learn them by heart. Gufa amar Rav Chanan el amar Rav kevan she'amar ubetoratecha katuv lemor shuv eno tzarich savor mine hani mini mili biyachid aval tzibor la itamar amar Rav Yehoshua ben Levi echad yachid ve'echad tzibor kevan de amar ubetoratecha katuv lemor shuv eno tzarich. Again, still debating about whether shliach tzibor discharges you. Amar Rabbi Elazar leolam yasdir adam tfilato ve'echad kach mitpalel. Rabbi Elazar said a person should always arrange their prayer in their mind and then only pray. Amar Rabbi Abba mistabra milta de Rabbi Elazar berachot shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom HaKippurim shel parakim aval dekol shana lo. Maybe not all the time. maybe just on the high holidays. Ini v'ha Rabbi Yehuda misadar tzolote umitzale shani Rabbi Yehuda kevan de mit latin yoma ulat latin yoma havi mitzale kifakrin dimai. Therefore, pray in the weekday prayers. Your recitation should be intermittent. Amar Rav Acha bar Ivara, Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida, Poter Haya Rabban Gamliel Afilu Am Shebasadot. Velama mi boy hani mekaime hacha, right? Even people who are exempted from the may be exempted by the Shaliach Tzibor if they're away in the fields. Adaraba, hani anisi, hani lo anisi. That really is only when those are circumstances beyond your control. Detani abba bere de Rav Binyamin bar Chia am she'achure kohanim eno bichlal beracha. We are very close to the end. Ela ki ata rabin amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Ide amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida. Lo patar Rabban Gamliel ela al shebasadot my taima mishum de anisi b'melacha aval be'ir lo. People who work in the fields in a situation which is beyond their control, they can be exempted. But if you live in a city and you don't come to synagogue, you are not exempted. For those people are able to prepare their prayers and pray by themselves. We're going to hold off on the Hadran Alecha until Friday, and I think Rabbi Adelson has claimed it. But we have completed, up till now, Rosh Hashanah, and it only took 3 years and 10 months. I hope everybody is well, and I'll see you guys in the next tractate of Gemara, or in Chazara, because we're going to spend a few more months actually spending more time with this. All right, thanks for